So, probably I don't think I've told anybody where I grew up. I grew up in Hague Park on the shores of Vandercook Lake, which is on a chain of 5 lakes, which is always good when you go fishing, because if it wasn't good on one lake, you could just boat to the other. And most of you probably never even heard of it. That's okay. It's kind of a small town in Jackson's shadow. And the only reason it actually exists as a town at all is because of a boardwalk and amusement park that used to occupy 110 acres of the eastern shore of the lake. Up until 1890, it was all farmlands. And one of those farmers, Hague, decided that he was going to use some of his land to create a picnic park by the lake. And by 1907, there was a vaudeville theater, a dance hall, a bowling alley, a shooting gallery, rental boats, a carousel, a roller rink, balloon ascensions, which I still don't know what those were considered back then, ball games, concessions, a steamboat that offered rides around the lake, and the crown jewel, a figure-8 roller coaster called the Jackrabbit. You can still actually see the concrete footings of the Jackrabbit in the park and in the lake. And Hague Park was permanently closed in 1938, a victim of a fire and a depression at the same time. In its heyday, people would go to Hague Park by the thousands during the summer. Record was 20,000 in one day. And after a while, people would build cabins near the lake so they could spend multiple days at the park. And after a while, those cabins took form as homes, and naturally a few businesses were going to pop up around it. One of those, seems always to be the case, was a bar. Mitch's Bar. For most of my youth, Mitch's Bar was the place you don't go after dark. It was a place of mystery and danger. It was one of those dimly lit places where people drank away their troubles and inevitably got into fights that went out into the parking lot. And then in 1984, Mitch's was bought by Clyde Miro. And Clyde is a cook by trade. And he took out the wall between that building and a storefront next door and put in the Cranberry Cafe. And as you can imagine, it took a while for the Cranberry Cafe to get any traction, being attached to Mitch's, which the bar still held that name. And Mitch's Bar's regulars were, not the type of go-getters to seek out new horizons. But Clyde's a good guy at heart, and so he decided to use the usually empty cafe to feed the football team between practices on 2-a-days during the summer. And we used the bar TVs. They would put in videotapes of old games or highlight reels and things like that we could watch. In fact, he was the one who introduced me to the Reuben sandwich, which is my favorite. It is my go-to test for any restaurant. How good is your Reuben? And I would often go after practice during the season to get a Reuben, because, when you were a teenager, you could eat like that. And he's one of those guys who also has that knack of remembering the things that go unnoticed by most people. And so the second he saw me coming in, he knew exactly what I was going to be ordering and exactly how I liked it. Extra sauerkraut and Thousand Island. Thank you very much. Over time, either by luck or by strategy, probably a little of both, most of the drunks abandoned niches. Apparently it was becoming a little too reputable. And the cafe became the restaurant he'd hoped for. Like everyone though, Clyde had his own struggles to deal with every now and again, and last fall, he had a problem with his house. And a little existential crisis thrown in just for that extra zing, right? I guess the way it started was kind of a fluke. He had come home from the cafe one night in mid-September to an oak tree on his house. Or in his roof, I should say. No storm, no freezing rain, no strong winds that day. Apparently, according to Larry Bowens, who's Hague Park's tree service guy, it was gypsy moths. Ate it from the inside out, and it just happened to give that day. And as anybody who's ever had to go to insurance to get the money to do repairs, it took several weeks. And then a couple more weeks to get some roofers in to get the roof fixed. And then when the masons finished the chimney repairs, they left without putting the chimney cap on. You know, that thing that goes or keeps the rain from going in there. And mostly in Hague Park, it's the squirrels, because they will eat acorns and young pine cones and just throw them anywhere. Just stash them. Being a cheapskate at heart, Clyde decided that instead of waiting for the masons to schedule and get a time to come back and then have to pay them for that extra time, that he would just do it himself. So that's why he went up on the roof. Which, you know, getting on a roof doesn't seem like it should be all that hard, right? Clyde's house is one of those old cabins that they built way back in the day. Just had a couple of expansions put on, so the roof angle is not particularly steep, and the eave is only about 8 feet off the ground. In fact, he didn't even have to extend the extension ladder to prop it against the house. The situation put that way doesn't seem all that bad until you consider one very important detail. Clyde is truly, madly, deeply terrified of heights. He wasn't afraid of getting hurt. It had been raining for a few days before that, so the ground was pretty squishy actually in that part of town. Leaves piled up around his house, and so he knew in his head that he wouldn't get injured if somebody threw him off of that roof. But these things are not really about rational considerations, are they? It's about fear. With the top end of the ladder propped against the roof, he began this little dance and started cycling himself up, pacing back and forth. Start to put a leg up on the rung and then just kind of turn around and go back. And finally, after about 3 or 4 rounds of that dance, his foot caught on something. And he stumbled probably on a blade of grass, because we've all done something like that too, right? Or a white stripe on a road. And he had a choice to make. He could either catch himself and just use his momentum to climb the ladder, or he could go face first into the ladder itself. So he half stumbled, half panicked his way to the top of the ladder, and when he got to the edge of the roof, he faced challenge number 2. He had to get off that ladder and onto the roof. This meant climbing to nearly the top of the ladder and taking just a little step up and to the left. He could not do it. And there was no errant blade of grass to help him in this next step. So while he was standing there at the top of the ladder, building up some chutzpah, I guess, he noticed on the top rung a warning light. You know, the kind of helpful admonition that the government and lawyers make everybody put on everything nowadays. Like, my favorite is the lawnmower, when you see the sticker on the deck that says caution, spinning blades. Yep, that's why I bought it. Anyway, the sticker on Clyde's ladder read, caution. This is not a step. Do not stand on it. You might fall. Now, this is a profoundly unnecessary piece of advice for people with Clyde's condition. He already knew he might fall. In fact, that thought never left his mind for a second. And this friendly little reminder only served to increase his paranoia. Well, there he was, paralyzed on the ladder, warning stuck at eye level, unable to take that one small step that would have him up on the roof. And he stood there for a long time, seeing the simple thing that he had to do and being completely incapable of doing it, for fear that that little step would be his last. Now, as far as I know, Clyde is not an overtly religious man. And he felt a little embarrassed at that moment because he had to appeal to a higher power to lift his foot and travel less than 3 feet onto the roof. He finally took refuge in repeating Psalm 23, reciting those words over and over and over again. And finally, he got his left foot onto the roof without incident. And from there, the rest of him quickly followed. As you can imagine, it probably wasn't very graceful looking. In fact, it looked very much like a fish trying to flop itself back into the water. But he was on the roof. And he quickly scrambled behind the chimney, which is fairly wide, so that he could sit against it in a little bit of security. And maybe stop worrying about falling for a couple minutes and just catch his breath. And when he finally did, of course, as these things do, it only took a few minutes to get the cap in place. And now he had a whole new world of trouble sitting behind that chimney. He had to get down from the roof. Of course, for him, there was no rush into anything. He didn't have anything urgent to do. It was his day off. In fact, it occurred to him that maybe he really didn't need to come down at all. The view was interesting from up there. He could see the neighborhood from a new vantage point. The weather was pretty warm for late October. And so he just thought, why not just stay here a while? Getting down off the roof would require for him some diligent and detailed planning. It involved getting out from behind the chimney, walking back to the ladder without fainting or vomiting, taking a completely unprotected step off the roof and onto the ladder, which may or may not stay in place when he does it. And as he was thinking about all of these things, it suddenly seemed to Clyde that that was a huge risk to take for the very meager benefit of getting on with his life. At that moment in time, taking out his own appendix seemed less dangerous. So sitting there behind the chimney, he got to thinking, why am I so afraid? What am I afraid of? Well, it's pretty obvious, isn't it? He was afraid a sudden gust of gravity would overcome his ability to hold on to where he was and draw him against his will through the air and to the ground. He was absolutely certain that he would not be badly hurt if that happened. He could see the ground, see how close it was, how soft it was. A little bruising, maybe a little shaking up. Well, that's probably the worst that was going to happen. He did, though, imagine breaking a bone and having to drag himself across the ground like a hero at the low point of the action film. Gasping as he struggled into the house, a trail of blood between the door and the phone to call for backup. But even then he knew he wouldn't die. None of that mattered, though. Because he wasn't afraid of landing. He was afraid of falling. Something inside him was convinced that his first step would send him sliding unstoppably down the roof. And when he stood up, it felt like the edge of the roof was drawing him towards it, sucking him in, as if there was no safe place to put down his foot. No movement seemed safe. The only thing that guaranteed he would not fall was staying right where he was. He thought perhaps a therapist could help with this problem. It might be a good idea to see one and finally get over this nonsense so that he can enjoy things like mountains and canyons and the performance of simple household tasks. Of course, in order to find a therapist, he'd have to get down off the roof first, and he did not know how to do that. And he started to get down on himself. There are much scarier things to be feared in the world than falling off a roof. There are people out there who have confronted death or some genuine evil that might be just a little bit impatient with his little roof phobia. And not without good reason. But here he was, and the fear of what lay ahead overwhelmed him. Staring into that tremendous unknown, the only safe thing to do was stay put. To make any move away from this place would likewise mean moving forward into the unknown. Better to stay paralyzed, silent, and unmoving. And I guess that's no different than any of us, really. We all love the comfort and predictability of rhythms, whether they're good for us or not. To make a change or to risk something we're not even sure we can do just creates chaos. And there's enough of that to deal with every day. Better to stay where we are. Keep doing those things we can at least predict the outcomes of. Clyde did eventually get down from the roof. Giving no airs, by the way, of vast courage in that process. In fact, he's not really sure at all what happened. He remembered standing up and then finding himself on the ground shivering like a shaved chihuahua on an ice rink. But the part in between standing up and coming to is a complete blank to him. So that's the story from back home in Hague Park, where nothing much ever happens and everybody's just fine with that.